That news that a ceasefire in Gaza may be imminent comes just days before the end of Joe Biden's presidency, and it's coincided with the president's final foreign policy speech. Mr. Biden used that speech to argue that his administration has left America in a stronger position against foreign adversaries than when he first took office. Our Global Affairs Editor John Lyons is with me in the studio now. So, John, Joe Biden has argued in that address that America is in a stronger position now than it was 4 years ago. Would you agree with that?
Well, Mel, like most people's records, it's quite mixed in terms of successes and failures. He's right when he says that some of America's adversaries are certainly weaker now than they were a year or two ago, particularly Iran and its main proxy, Hezbollah, is certainly weaker due to what's been happening in the Middle East in the last 2 years. And likewise, Hamas as well in Gaza. But then if you look at both Ukraine and Gaza, two of the main wars that have happened on his watch, Russia is slowly winning the war in Ukraine. And people I speak to say a lot of that's had to do with how slow America has been at delivering a lot of these weapons that Ukraine needed, that in a way America didn't want to see Vladimir Putin defeated because they were worried about what would come next. So they wanted just to keep Ukraine in there in a bit of a gridlock. But in fact, Russia is now winning. And Gaza, of course, is a complete humanitarian catastrophe now. That's happened under Joe Biden's watch. 6 months ago or so, he said to the Israelis, "You are indiscriminately bombing Gaza," which is one of the most densely populated civilian areas in the world. Not that you're targeting Hamas, you are indiscriminately bombing, yet he continued month after month to be supplying the bombs which were doing this indiscriminate bombing. And so I think that Gaza, history will judge Joe Biden as having allowed a complete humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. The number of women and children who have been killed is extraordinary, and Israel won't let journalists in there. But if there is a ceasefire and we do go in there, my feeling from talking to people is it will be so much worse, the humanitarian catastrophe, than we know. In fact, the Norwegian Refugee Council put a report out recently saying humanity is being erased in Gaza.
This speech that Joe Biden's just given is coming while there are ceasefire talks going on in the Middle East at the moment. How significant do you think a deal would be at this point in Joe Biden's presidency, and how desperately do you think they are working to have that happen before he leaves office?
There is certainly a lot of activity. We've seen a bit of this before, a few false dawns. Israel, of course, in terms of what we're talking about just before, would always argue that Hamas embeds itself in civilian targets. Therefore, there will inevitably be collateral damage of civilians. In terms of this ceasefire, in fact, it's more about Donald Trump than it is about Joe Biden. I've never seen a president who, before he walks in to take his oath on January 20 next week, has had already a huge impact. Now, both the Israelis and Hamas, for different reasons, are trying to come together with a deal. Donald Trump has said there's all hell to pay if those hostages, 101 or so, are not released by the time I'm president. That's a driving force for Hamas. Israel, though, also wants to try to resolve this before Donald Trump becomes president. And so I think that this is the strongest suggestion of a ceasefire. My own instinct and talking to people is that we'll see a ceasefire probably by the end of this week.
Just take us through what goes into those ceasefire discussions. You say it could happen by the end of this week. What kind of conversations are taking place right now? What is each side calling for?
Well, they're meeting in Doha, in Qatar, neutral territory. Mossad, the Israeli Foreign Intelligence Service, has representatives there. Hamas are there. They're in the same building and the same precinct, which is actually quite rare. Often they're at different locations. And the Americans and the Qataris Qataris are trying to broker them. The outgoing American ambassador to Israel has given a fascinating interview to the Times of Israel where he talks about this and says that there were so many points at which the government of Israel, they were close to a ceasefire. This is what the outgoing ambassador said. And he said that there were points at which the government of Israel took private and small differences and widened them and made them public, essentially to say that therefore we can't do a ceasefire deal. This time, though, after 15 months, there's not much more there for Israel to bomb, and I think there's an imperative for both sides to do this deal.
We've been reporting this week that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, has been sounding out his cabinet to see whether they would resign over this deal. What do you think that indicates about how seriously he's taking this deal and how seriously he's taken other negotiations previously?
He has two ministers, very far-right ministers in the cabinet, as we know, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, who have both huffed and puffed and said if there's a deal, we will leave the government, bring down the government. However, Benjamin Netanyahu is an extraordinary survivor, and he has in place different alliances and factions like Yair Lapid, a prominent moderate there, and others are saying they will fill the breach. So in other words, if these two ministers take their numbers from the government, the others will come in and keep the government in power. So it looks like Benjamin Netanyahu has worked out a political deal whereby he can actually agree to the ceasefire, may lose those two ministers, but can keep the government of his government in power.
Just returning to Joe Biden now, in his speech this morning, he said that history would show the withdrawal that he oversaw of troops in Afghanistan. He said history would show that that was the right way to go about it. What do you make of that claim?
Look, when you look at the pictures of that retreat, I mean, they were like the last days of the Americans in Vietnam. They were chaotic, they were desperate, people hanging off planes. If Joe Biden thinks that is a model, then you'd have to question his judgment. The broader point, though, of should they have left there, the way they left firstly was completely badly planned. Essentially, after spending billions and hundreds of billions of dollars, the Taliban returned to power. Afghanistan was an unmitigated and catastrophic disaster for the West. They did not make the alliances that they should have internally that were sustainable. And I'm surprised that Joe Biden would try to argue, firstly, the dramatic scenes of people fleeing, and secondly, how can the return of the Taliban, putting the women and girls of Afghanistan back into the barbaric Middle Ages, how can Joe Biden regard that as a success?
Joe Biden's handling of Russia's aggression against Ukraine will also be pretty key to how his legacy goes down in history. How do you think that will be remembered?
Again, for Joe Biden to be trying to argue that this is a war Ukraine's losing, and a lot of the media don't like to say that because a lot of people are supporting Ukraine. They were the ones invaded. Ukraine's losing the war. There's no question of that. And Russia is winning over time. Again, I can't see how Joe Biden can claim that as a victory in any way. The criticisms of Joe Biden have been that he didn't provide the Ukrainians with what they wanted. They've been trying to fight this war without fighter jets. You can't fight a modern war without any air superiority. The Americans delayed and dragged the chain on the F-16s and others. Again, he can argue that we have made many of America's adversaries weaker. Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, no question. That's on his positive side. But to be using Afghanistan or Ukraine or Gaza as success stories makes you wonder about his judgment.